Welcome back to week 2 of our Women and Religion class. We'll be looking today at women in the Bible, starting in the earliest times that we have recorded about women operating in faith. We'll be looking at women in both testaments, the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures, still used by Jewish folk, and women in the New Testament or the Christian scriptures, which are some of the earliest records we have of how women were living with and under and understanding faith in Christ. But before we look at these texts, we need to talk a little bit about how people understand the Bible, how to think about it, because there are several different views, and whichever view you choose will affect how you understand the stories that we find within the Bible. So let's take a look at that. Now, we have students in the class from many different traditions and denominations, and some who don't practice any faith at all, and that's all good. But I'm going to start off with a text from Catholicism. I can't look at every particular denomination, but I'm going to start with, I said, one from Catholicism, and this comes from the Second Vatican Council, which was a council in the 1960s intended to bring the church up to date and to reconcile Catholicism, Catholic Christianity, with scientific advances and new ways of understanding the world. So church leaders were trying to reconcile belief in the Bible with new scientific discoveries, and people had even found factual errors in the scriptures. And I said, well, how can we believe in this then if we know that there are things that are factually untrue in the Bible? So Catholicism landed on the statement that the Bible teaches firmly, faithfully, and without error that truth which God wanted to put into the sacred writings for the sake of our salvation. And this is rather long and complicated, but note that the point is that the truth that we find in the Bible is truth that is for the sake of people's salvation, not for the sake of teaching about science or evolution, for example, or maybe not for the sake of teaching about how people should relate to one another, but for the sake of salvation. I want to point out how this is different than some other ways that people articulate how to understand the Bible. One of the words that people use sometimes is inerrant, which means there are no mistakes. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing inaccurate in the Bible. Well, that can be complicated sometimes if you, for example, want to look at the story of creation in Genesis 1 that we looked at last week. God creates the whole world in 6 days and rests on the seventh day. If you call the Bible inerrant, does that mean you have to believe that creation, in fact, took 6 literal days? It's a challenging question. There are Christians who believe, in fact, that the Bible teaches that creation happened in 6 days, and therefore they must believe that. And there are others who understand it differently. But this is a challenge that comes up when we talk about understanding the Bible, understanding scriptures. Another word that gets used for the Bible is inspired. People refer to the Bible as inspired by God. I've heard people call it God-breathed. Now that gives you a little more room possibly than inerrant. God inspired people, humans, to write the various books of the Bible. Well, to what extent then does each book of the Bible reflect the inspiration that that person received from God and that person's own understanding of the world coming from his own culture? And I say his because, as far as we can tell, all of the scriptures were written by male authors. So we can't expect a man in the year, let's say 47 of the Common Era, from the Middle East, no less, to think and understand the world that we do here in the 21st century in New England, right? We all absorb ideas from our culture, and it's nearly impossible to get rid of those. So if we say that the Bible was inspired, then we have to determine how much of that author's own culture he brought into his writing, and how much of what God inspired him to write was there independent of the culture. These are tickly questions, and it can be tempting to just ignore them and rush in, but our understanding, our interpretation of to what extent the Bible reflects what God wanted to put in it, and to what extent the Bible reflects the human cultural realities of the people who wrote it, that's going to interpret how we understand and how we apply the writings of the scriptures. So these are very important questions to begin with, and they might help to make for a good discussion post. In your tradition, if you come from a tradition of faith, how do people understand the origin or the writing of the Bible? What have you heard? What do you think yourself? How does it matter? Why does it matter? I encourage you to think about these things when you go on to write your post for this week. Now we're going to look at several different passages about women found in the Bible, and I've listed those on the syllabus, and there are more, as you'll note, listed at the end of our first chapter from our textbook, which you'll also be reading for this week. So I encourage you to do that reading before you go further here and listen to not only my thoughts, but the thoughts of some authors that I'll be sharing with you all. And as I did last week, I encourage you not to throw aside your own interpretations or ideas based on what I present here, but to put them side by side and compare and contrast. I'm not trying to tell you what the right answers are. I'm trying to tell you what many feminist scholars have found here. And I just want you to give you this as food for thought. All right, so let's dive into our first pair of stories, two stories of creation found in the first two chapters of Genesis, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Now, we looked at Genesis 1 last week, in which there are 6 days of creation, and on the sixth day, God creates humanity, men and women, in God's own image. Immediately following that, beginning in chapter 2, verse 4, there's another story of creation as if the first one wasn't even there. And in that story, maybe a more familiar one, God creates the man, calls him the man Adam, and then with God's help, God creates all sorts of animals, and the man gets to name them all. And the hope is that one of those animals will be a helper for God, for the man. But as it turns out, none of them are really good helpers. And so God needs to try again. God puts the man to sleep, takes out one of his ribs, builds a new human around that rib. That is the first woman, Eve. And then when the man wakes up, he says, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This is the helper that I needed. So we've got some questions here. First of all, why are there two separate stories about creation in the Bible, right? Why did God create the world twice, and so we need this two different stories? Most scholars think that these two stories were written at two different times by two different sets of people, and they believe that the second story about creating Eve from Adam's rib was the older story. But whoever assembled the book of Genesis decided that both of these stories need to be included. Does each one have something to teach us? And what might those lessons be? For the purpose of our class, it might be helpful to look at what is the role of woman in each of these two stories. In Genesis 1, the role of the woman, just like the role of the man, seems to be a steward of the earth, right? God tells the people, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish and the birds and all the living things. And he says to them, I've given you every plant in order to eat. In Genesis 1, it seems like people are vegetarians, actually. So the role of the woman, just like the role of the man, is to be caretakers for all that God has created. And the role of the woman in the second story of creation, in Genesis 2, seems to be to a helper. The old-fashioned word helpmeet was included in some translations. To be a helper to man and to bear women. We read at the end of chapter 2, therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. So this tells us this story tells us something about the relationship between man and women from the perspective of the ancient days when it was written. And that brings us to the third chapter of Genesis, Genesis 3, which is includes the very famous story of Adam and Eve and the apple and the snake. Now, I want to share from you some commentary from the Women's Bible Commentary. This part was written by author Susan Niditch, and she's writing about this story. She says the following: like Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, Genesis 3 is also about a movement from a fixed and unchanging world to a new non-static order. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 describe the way in which a sterile world is replaced by one teeming with life. In Genesis 3, the change is from a well-provisioned, closely controlled world, lacking discernment, social roles, and sexual status, to a world in which men and women, man and woman, relate to each other sexually and according to social roles, a world in which they work hard and know the difference between good and evil. The world after Eden is clearly one of birth and death, whereas the garden had been an in-between world in which no human had eaten from the tree of life, but in which no one had yet given birth. It is a wonderful tale about a trickster snake, a woman who believes the snake, and a rather passive, even comical man. Biblical writers comment on the inevitability of reality as they perceived it, wistfully presenting an image of an easier, smoother life. Woman, the one who will house life within her, helps to generate this new, active, challenging life beyond Eden. All too often, readers come to Genesis weighed down by Augustine's or Milton's interpretations of the story, that it is the woman's fault that sin comes into the world, that this is original sin, a phrase which does not appear in the book of Genesis, as a matter of fact, and that the man is rather less guilty than the woman. What if one notices that the snake does not lie to the woman, but speaks the truth when it says that the consequence of eating from the forbidden tree is gaining the capacity to discern good and evil, a godlike power which the divinity jealously guards? And she could suggest that you compare the snake's words in chapter 3, verse 5, with God's words in chapter 3, verse 22. The snake, like the Greek giant Prometheus, who was said to have given fire to humankind, is a trickster, a character having the capacity to transform situations and overturn the status quo. This trickster has less power than the great gods, but enough mischief and nerve to shake up the cosmos and alter it forever. The woman believes the snake, and in an important pun, the narrator says that she sees that the tree is good to look at, good for making one wise. She is no easy prey for a seducing demon, as later tradition represents her, but a conscious actor choosing knowledge. Together with the snake, she is a bringer of culture. The man, on the other hand, is utterly passive. The woman gives him the fruit, and he eats it as if he were a baby. With the eating comes the marks of social life and culture, knowledge of good versus evil, clothing that defines and conceals, and gender roles. The woman is to be the bearer of children, the mother of all life. The husband is to work the ground, which will now only grudgingly yield its fruits. A clear hierarchy is established, woman and her offspring over the clever snake, who is now reduced to a mere dust-eating reptile, and man over woman. The status establishing punishments meted out to man and woman and the social roles they are assigned do reflect the author's male-oriented worldview, but no weighty accusation of original sin brought about by the woman is found in the text. This is a later interpretation from authors with different theologies and worldviews. What the author of Genesis does reveal is that man and woman share responsibility for the alteration of their status. The man's self-defense, like his passive active disobedience, portrays him in a childlike manner, blaming Eve. When accused by God of defying his order, the man says comically, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate." Whose fault is it? The woman's, or maybe God's. And yet the woman initiates the act. fact, it is she who first dares to eat of God's tree, to consume the fruit of the divine, thereby becoming, as the rabbi says of human beings, like the angels in having the capacity to discriminate, and like the animals who eat, fornicate, defecate, and die. The woman herself comes to have the most earthy and most divine of roles, conceiving, containing, and nurturing new life. She is an especially appropriate link between life in God's garden and life in the thornier world to which all of us are consigned. So I invite you to think about some of those ideas and how later people reinterpreted the story to encourage us to see the snake as a liar, or the woman as deceived, or all of this as the woman's fault. Cultures always interpret the Bible from their own standpoint, but I encourage you to read what the Bible says and not assume that what other later people have added to that story is the truth. So let's turn to our next story, also found in the book of Genesis. And these are stories of Rachel and Leah. In these stories, our hero, although that's a dubious term for him, is Jacob, a young man, one of the patriarchs of Judaism, one of the forefathers of Judaism, who leaves home in order to find a new life and works for a man named Laban. And Laban has two sisters, and they are Leah, who's older, and Rachel, who's younger. Jacob falls in love with Rachel, who the Bible tells us is beautiful. Leah has either beautiful eyes or weak eyes. The translation is not really clear there. And it's ironic, just to pause for a moment, when people talk about having biblical values or biblical marriages or relationships. This is a very unhappy marriage between a man and two women. So this is an example of polygamy, maybe not what some of those people want to encourage in our society. At any rate, it makes you wonder, what's the purpose of this story? This is certainly not to tell you how to have a happy marriage. See what lessons you draw from this story. And I should add, although the image that I've got here shows us Jacob and Leah and Rachel and their children, it doesn't show us other women in the story, Bilhah, who's Rachel's maid, and Zilpah, who is Leah's maid. And as you read, Rachel and Leah draw them in to their scheme, their competition for who can have the most children. Notice how all of these women are treated, all four of them. Where in the story does each woman get to exercise her own free will and her own choice? Or where does she not get to do that? Where do we see the feelings of these four women? For example, do we know, in fact, that Leah actually wanted to marry Jacob? How did she feel about that marriage? Or Rachel, how did she feel about the marriage? Do we read in the Bible that the sisters were close before Jacob became this homewrecker and wedged them apart? We definitely in the story find the importance of having children. Children are insurance that a woman will be cared for even after her husband dies. Children are what allow women to boast in the society. And being childless meant that the woman had no power. It meant that God had not blessed her with children, and so therefore she was under divine disfavor. And it opened her up to the possibility of starvation. Childless women and widows were among the least powerful women in society, and so having children was a form of protection and insurance, and were seen as divine favor. So, given all of that, you can understand how desperate Leah and Rachel were to have children, and therefore why they might draw their maids into this scheme to have as many children as possible. I invite you to share your thoughts on these wild stories when you post for this week in our discussion forum. That brings us to another Hebrew scripture story of women found in the book of Proverbs. I forgot the B in my slide, and now I feel terrible about that. Not Proverbs, but Proverbs. Proverbs 31 is a fascinating account of women, and it has made some women very happy and some women very frustrated. And so I'm curious to see which way you feel about it. I do want to note, as you read these verses, that the phrase that is translated capable wife can also be translated woman of worth. It means the both things. So the same term for wife could be used for woman. So does it matter whether we understand it as about a capable wife or understand it as about a woman of worth? Which of those phrases do you prefer and why? These verses are an acrostic, meaning that the first verse begins with the letter A and the second verse begins with the letter B, and so on and so forth. So it's a form of poetry that that tries to demonstrate wholeness or completion by using up every single letter in the alphabet. In Proverbs 31, the woman fulfills the roles given to her by society, which mean caring for her home and her family. For example, she's not praised for writing books or for leading communities or for building architecture. As I noted, some women find Proverbs 31 to be empowering and inspiring, lifting up the value of women. However, some find it oppressive and exhausting. They can't, who could possibly complete all of the tasks that are listed in these verses? I mean, this poor woman must be exhausted, and her role is restricted to that of the family and the children. Again, what do you think? Is Proverbs 31 empowering or oppressive? How do you read it? What does it mean to you? And that brings us to the first of our stories about women from the Christian scriptures, the New Testament. And I invite you to turn to Luke chapter 1. This may be a familiar passage, particularly for folks coming from the Catholic tradition, where this story is known as the Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel shows up to Mary and says, "Surprise, you are going to have a child, and not in the way that most people expect." Now, this story is also worth unpacking. We're very familiar with the account of Mary being a virgin, right? The virgin birth we refer to. Virgin Mary, we call her. And the word virgin does appear in Luke chapter 1. It comes from the book of Isaiah, which is from the Hebrew scriptures and was written hundreds of years before Luke. And in Isaiah, let me see if I can turn to it quickly, chapter 7, verse 14, we read a prophecy about a coming ruler for the people, for the Jewish people. Here I'm reading from chapter 7, verse 14 of Isaiah. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel." Isaiah, the term used in Isaiah by Isaiah, technically means young woman. It doesn't necessarily mean virgin. That phrase was adopted by Matthew and Luke, and a mistranslation by Matthew and Luke therefore indicated that Mary was a virgin. So here's an interesting point. Some scholars believe that you can read the first chapter in Luke's gospel, which in a way that leaves room for Mary to conceive Jesus in the normal way that human babies are conceived. In other words, she might sleep with her spouse, Joseph, conceive a baby, and then the Spirit would come over her unborn baby and make that baby the Son of God. That is clearly not what many Christian faiths teach, but I encourage you to go back and read Luke 1 with fresh eyes and see how you understand it. I also want to point out Mary's song. She bursts into song after visiting her cousin Elizabeth, who was also miraculously pregnant. And what Mary sings is not what you would expect from a young woman who's talking about maybe knitting baby clothes or decorating the nursery. Mary sings, "My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior, who has looked with favor on the lowliness of God's servants." She goes on to praise God, not for making her pregnant, but for all the amazing things that God has done to save people. His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. God has brought down the powerful from their thrones. God has lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things. God has sent the rich away empty and hungry. These are amazingly prophetic, revolutionary, liberating words. People who have been oppressed have always turned to Mary's song called the Magnificat for hope about how God saves and protects the people, and especially those who are oppressed. So I want to challenge our typical ideas about Mary. We see her as meek and mild. We see her as quiet and accepting of her fate. But here, when she sings these words with her cousin Elizabeth, she's a prophet. She is singing words that could get her jailed in certain communities. If we read these words seriously, does that help us to see Mary in a new light or understand her in a new way? Now we're going to turn to another story about another Mary and Martha, and this one is found in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. The story of Mary and Martha, where Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet listening to him teach, and Martha is cleaning up in the kitchen, and Martha gets frustrated that Mary won't help her. This is a story that's really well known, but there's a recent pastor who has encouraged us to see it in an entirely new light. So this interpretation comes from Mary Stromer Hansen, a scholar, and she offered this at the Society of Biblical Literature in 2013, and you can also find it in her 2013 book called The New Perspective on Mary and Martha. Do not preach Mary and Martha again until you read this. So she notes that, again, our common assumptions about this story don't actually follow along with what Luke wrote in his gospel. For example, we take this story to assume that Jesus shows up with a whole bunch of followers, and they're hungry, and they appear at the doorstep of Mary and Martha. And so Martha, as a good host, tries to feed them all, and Mary doesn't help but sits at his feet. But she cautions us to look back in Luke 10 in these verses. The only people who are present are Martha and Jesus. Mary does not even seem to be present in the story. So she retranslates this story, and I'm going to offer you her translation. She's working from the Greek. Now, I am not a Greek scholar, so I can't say one way or the other whether this is more accurate than what we usually read. If any of you understand Greek, I invite you to think about that and reinterpret that. But here's her translation. She says, as they were on their way, he, Jesus, came to a village where a woman named Martha received him. She had a sister called Mary, who also was one who sat at the Lord's feet, always listening to his words. But Martha was constantly torn apart concerning much ministry. She suddenly approached him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister regularly leaves me to minister alone? Tell her, therefore, that she may give me a hand. But the Lord answered her, saying, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and agitated concerning much, but only one thing is needed. For Mary has chosen good, and it will not be taken away from her. So instead of translating the word diakonia, and you may recognize that in the word deacon, right? Deacons who are leaders of churches. Yeah, this passage includes the Greek word diakonia, and Hansen translates that as ministry rather than as service, which previous translators have used. They assume that the story is about women, so therefore it must be about service. And she says, no, diakonia we translate as ministry. She also notes that In the King James Version, there's something about Martha welcoming Jesus into her house, but the words into her house are not present in the Greek. So we don't see that this is happening in the context of a house, just in the context of a village somewhere. And she particularly looks at verse 39, where in our usual translations in modern English Bibles, often we hear that Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet listening to his word. So Mary's right there sitting down at Jesus' feet. But instead, Hanson translates this as she had a sister called Mary who also sat at Jesus' feet, which is a metaphorical way for describing somebody who's a pupil or a student of somebody else. So it says that Mary is Jesus' pupil, not that she's literally just sitting there at his feet, but that she also is one of his followers. So in Hanson's interpretation of the story, the problem is not between Mary, who's sitting at Jesus' feet learning from him, and Martha, who's cleaning dishes in the kitchen. The problem is between Martha, who is ministering in the village where they lived, and Mary, who seems to be ministering somewhere else. Since Jesus is traveling, Martha thinks that Jesus will be able to get word to his sister Mary, come back and help me in my ministry here in this town. And Jesus instead says, you're ministering here. Mary is ministering off somewhere else. Both things are good. Both places are necessary for ministry. How does understanding the story in this way make you think differently about Mary and Martha? I encourage you to take Hanson's ideas seriously and see what you think. See if that changes your picture of women in the scriptures and of this story in particular. Now we're going to turn to another gospel, and this is John's gospel. And in the Gospel of John, chapter 4, there's the famous story of the Samaritan woman, or the woman at the well. It's hot. It's the middle of the day. Jesus' followers have left him alone. He's thirsty. He goes to a well, and there's a woman there who's drawing water. And they get into a rather lengthy theological conversation about the right way to worship God, about who Jesus is, about how the woman has been living. Now, it's helpful to understand right off the bat that this woman had 3 strikes against her that we see hinted at in the scriptures. First of all, she's a Samaritan, and that may not mean much to you or I now, but the Samaritans were hated by the Jews. I can't emphasize to what extent Jewish people hated the Samaritans. They were similar but different enough that they were just detested, and they worshiped God in the wrong place, not at the Temple in Jerusalem, but on Mount Gerizim. So the Jews hated the Samaritans. Secondly, this woman was a woman, and Jesus was a man. And for a man to speak unaccompanied to an unknown woman, that was very dicey behavior. So that also is something showing us Jesus in a new light, but putting this woman in a difficult light. Thirdly, we know that she was out drawing water at noon. That's the hottest part of the day. Nobody else was out there drawing water at that time because that was a miserable time to be doing heavy work of pulling up the bucket from the well. The more esteemed members of the community would go when it was cooler, very, very early in the morning or late at night. To go in the middle of the day indicated that she wasn't allowed when other people were drawing waters. She wasn't permitted, or that she didn't want to be around them. So that indicates that there's something not quite right about her role in society. And of course, during the course of her conversation with Jesus, we learn that she has had several husbands and she's currently with a man who is not her husband. Now, that doesn't seem to trouble Jesus at all, so we shouldn't make too much of that. But it has troubled other interpreters who suggest that she's a prostitute or a woman of very loose morals, and so on and so forth. But again, in reading this story, I suggest we follow Jesus' model, which is not to judge her too harshly because of this. And we do know that the townspeople listened to what she says about Jesus afterwards. If she were so marginalized, maybe they wouldn't. So we're not quite sure what her relationship is with her community. But she is convinced that Jesus is special, and she returns with her news about him to the town, bringing everybody out then to come to know Jesus on their own and to follow him. She is, in other words, an apostle for Jesus. And he treats her as an equal, and she treats Jesus as an equal. They enter into conversation, they debate, they discuss, they turn to difficult topics like theology and religion. She is not marginalized in this story. In other words, we see a very strong, independent, thoughtful woman portrayed in this story from John. This is an ancient painting of Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well, and the painter, adds one more layer of symbolism here. Note the well that Jesus is sitting at. It doesn't really look like a well. What it actually looks like is an ancient baptismal font in some of the earliest Christian churches. They built fonts that look like that. In his discussion with the woman, Jesus talks about living water, and he indicates that he is the source of that living water. And to further strengthen that point, the painter here paints him leaning on a baptismal font, the place where water brings all people into new life, according to Christian theology. So I find that an interesting addition to this story. Now we're going to skip from the beginning of John's gospel to the end of John's gospel in John chapter 20, and we have to talk about Mary Magdalene. I've got two pictures here of Mary Magdalene. The one on the left, notice her hair is loose. Her head is not covered. She's rather, I don't know how to put this, revealingly dressed. She's barefoot. She doesn't seem like a sophisticated, removed, careful woman of biblical times. She seems kind of loose, and she was painted to look that way. Notice the image on the right. Here, Mary is dressed like a woman of biblical times, holding the spices that she's going to use to anoint Jesus' body in Luke chapter 12, and also holding a cross. So what I want to discuss here is how Mary Magdalene gets from the woman on the right, which we read about in John chapter 20, to the woman on the left, who's loose and appealing and showing a lot of flesh. And Lord knows why people painted paintings of her. You can decide what you think the painters and the viewers were getting at there yourselves. Now, we read about Mary Magdalene in a couple of different places in the Bible, not just in John 20, but we also read about her in Luke's Gospel, Luke 8, chapter 2, where we find that Luke chapter 8, verse 2, let me get that right, we find that she's one of the women following Jesus. So Luke says, soon afterwards he, that's Jesus, went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their resources. In other words, these women were footing the bill. They were wealthy and powerful enough to help support financially Jesus' mission. So we know that Mary is one of these women. She's got some money, and she had had 7 demons that Jesus freed her from. Now that could mean anything. Many of the portraits of people tortured by demons in the Gospels seem to be portraits of people experiencing epileptic fits. So how folks understood demons back in the day might not be how we would understand what they were suffering from now. So that's Mary Magdalene. However, she gets conflated with another woman. Also, we can see in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 7, verses 37 through 48. Here's a story where the Pharisees invite Jesus to eat with them. Jesus takes his place, and a woman from the city who was a sinner, having learned that he was eating at the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster jar of ointment. She stood behind him at his feet, weeping, and began bathing his feet with her tears and drying them with her hair. And so then the folks around him say, well, if Jesus knew who she was and what kind of woman this is, Jesus wouldn't let her touch him. Jesus speaks up and he says, wait a minute, I've entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she's bathed my feet with her tears. You gave me no kiss when I entered, but she has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, her sins have been forgiven, and she has shown great love, and people will always tell this story about her. You can find that in Luke and Mark. Now, we don't know what the woman's sins are, just that she was sinful and the Pharisees looked down on her. Because of that, later interpreters assumed that her sins were sexual, that she was a prostitute of some sort, or again, a loose woman, and that Jesus allowed her to follow him. Number one, that woman is not called Mary Magdalene. She's not named. Luke does name Mary Magdalene later, so it seems very clear that if that were Mary Magdalene, Luke would have used her name there. Secondly, Luke simply says that she's a sinner. Later interpreters say, her sins are sexual, and this is Mary Magdalene. So a portrait of Mary Magdalene, this forgiven woman of loose morals, appeared, a portrait that actually is not biblical at all. What is biblical is the story we read in John 20, where Mary Magdalene goes to anoint Jesus' body. She finds instead an empty tomb, and she cries because her Lord, she believes, has been taken away. She then encounters Jesus, who she doesn't know that it is Jesus, and he finally clarifies that he is not a gardener, but is Jesus. She is thrilled, and he says to her, don't touch me yet, I haven't ascended, I am ascending to my Father. Go to my brothers, the disciples, and say to them that Jesus is ascending. Mary is given the most important task of being the first person to tell the disciples that Jesus has risen from the dead. Because of that, the Orthodox Christians, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and so on and so forth, call her the apostle to the apostles, the first woman to share the good news. She's given a position of authority rather than being seen as a woman of loose morals. So why do you think this story has changed? Why did people assume that Mary Magdalene was the woman wiping Jesus' feet and that her sins were sexual sins? Why isn't the story about her sharing the good news with the apostles, why isn't that story enough? Or maybe you know of other women whose stories have been changed through time. I invite you to share possibly about some of that in your discussion posts. Now we have two women's stories we're going to consider that are not from the Gospels. First is in the book of Acts, also written by the author who wrote Luke's Gospel, and he tells us in chapter 9 the story of Tabitha, whose name in Greek is Dorcas, so we can call her either. She's a woman who has done much good work in the community and has made clothes for the widows. Remember, widows don't have anyone to support them, so she's keeping alive the poorer members of the community. She dies, and people are devastated, and Peter comes and raises her up from the dead. Now, a couple of interesting things here. First of all, she is the only woman in the book of Acts to be called a disciple. And that word in Greek is mathatria. So she's given the feminine form of the word disciple. The only one in the book of Acts. What makes her special? How did she earn that term? What do you think? Secondly, this isn't the only story of someone being raised in Acts. It follows actually a few verses about Peter raising a man named Aeneas. He gets a couple of verses. Tabitha gets many, many verses, and her story is more interesting and colorful and detailed and more affecting to us. It's clear that she's a philanthropist and she is doing the work of the community. And she's important enough that Jesus feels the need to heal her. So there's Tabitha, also called Dorcas. The next passage in 1 Corinthians, Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, found in chapter 11, is an interesting passage And it feels at first glance, at first read, to be constricting women, right? Saying that women have got to keep their heads covered in worship, and any woman who doesn't have her head covered is disgracing herself and disgracing the church. And it might seem like Paul is giving the women a hard time. Or if you're a fan of beautiful church hats, it may seem like this has given birth to a whole amazing, wonderful tradition. And I want to note that there are many Christian traditions in which women do cover their heads in worship. I've got several images of them up here. So it can feel like, oh, this is Paul bashing down women, making sure they have their heads covered. However, if we read a little more closely, notice, when do they have to have their head covered? They have to have their head covered when they are praying or prophesying. In other words, when they are speaking out loud in the church, when taking a leadership role. Paul says that men can pray and prophesy, but they should do that with their heads uncovered. Maybe that's why folks take their baseball caps off when they enter a church. And women can pray or prophesy, but they should do so with their heads covered. So this is an example of finding what we expect to find in the scriptures. If we expect that the Bible is going to tell stories of men taking authority and women not having authority, then we focus on the fact that women have to have their heads covered. But if we go in with open eyes, we notice that Paul is actually describing that women have the same roles that men do, praying and prophesying. There's no difference except for that women should cover their heads and men should not. There's more equality in the scriptures than we might think. And I want to warn us that we tend to assume that nowadays things are more liberal, and in the ancient times things were more conservative. In other words, we assume that people have gotten more rights as time has progressed. But that is not helpful or often a true assumption to make. As a matter of fact, women's roles and women's rights tend to go up and down and up and down, and we see that even now today. So I want to invite us to see a little bit further into how the early church was treating women. So we've seen many stories here, and there are many others that I haven't lifted up. I encourage you to look at the list of scriptures at the end of that first chapter in our book, Women and Religion. There are women who are leading churches, like Priscilla with her husband Aquila in the book of Acts, and she's also mentioned in 1 Corinthians. There are women that Paul calls fellow workers. As a matter of fact, one of them in his letter to the Romans, Junia, he describes as foremost among the apostles. And we noted that Tabitha was called a disciple. So it's very clear that there are women, disciples, and apostles, women who follow Jesus, women who are sharing the news like Mary and Martha. So women played an important role and a leadership role in the early church. Now, this made later Christians uncomfortable. And as a matter of fact, some of these later generations, when recopying the scriptures, would change the names of these women and use a masculine form of the name instead to cover up that women had leadership and to make it look like men were the only leaders. We have handwritten scriptural copies from the early centuries of the church where this has happened. So we know this happened. This is a fact. Why, maybe, were women given leadership roles in the church? In Paul's day, the church was domestic. Churches, congregations met in people's houses. And in Jewish and Greek society at the time, the woman's role was often within the house, whereas the man's role might be outside of the house. Women had authority over the children and over cleaning and taking care of the house. That means if the Christian congregation is meeting in the house, it's more natural for women to have authority within that home church that was women's sphere of influence. So it wasn't terribly remarkable that there were women leaders in the church. However, this contrasted with gender ideas of the time in the Greco-Roman world. So those ideas were that gender was on a continuum, that male, the masculine, was on the perfect, completed end of that continuum, and women, the female, were somewhere less complete, less perfected, less finished than men were. Women were sort of incomplete men who hadn't fully developed. The Greco-Roman world believed that women were biologically inferior and weaker, and that therefore they were weaker intellectually as well. I encourage you to stop and think, does that idea still exist in our society or in our various cultures? Are there ideas that one gender is more complete, more perfect than the other? So we know that early Christian practice differed from what we found in the Greco-Roman world. The early Christian churches allowed women to have leadership, whereas outside of the church, in the Greco-Roman world, women could have no leadership at all. So which is going to win? The small community of Christianity and its practices, or the broader Roman culture? And it is clear in church history that the broader Roman culture won. With time, as decades passed, Christian churches curtailed women's leadership abilities, and they did this in order to survive. The very first Christians believed that Jesus was going to return within a year at the most, and that then everyone would be brought up to heaven. So it didn't matter too much how they got along with the broader society. But as time passed and Jesus didn't return, Christians needed to reconcile the fact that they were going to be here for the long haul, and they needed to be able to get along with the broader society. So you find a lot in Paul's letters telling people, keep your heads down, don't attract attention, follow the rules, be a good citizen of the community and where you live. Don't make Christians look bad. And one of the ways in which the early Christian communities decided that they could not make Christians look bad was to follow Greco-Roman ideas about gender rather than these early Christian ideas about gender. So as I said, don't assume that the older things are more conservative and the later ways are more permissive or more liberal. That's not really what we see when we look at the history of women within Christianity. I want to suggest some more books if you would be interested in reading just a little bit further. So as I mentioned, I drew from the Women's Bible Commentary. There it is in blue, edited by Carol Newsom and Sharon Ringe. There's a lot of fascinating stuff there about all the books of the Bible and what it means to look at the Bible from a feminist lens. Then on the left, I've got two books that pull out stories of women from the scriptures. There's All the Women of the Bible, which includes the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, as well as the Christian scriptures or the New Testament. And secondly, I've got Gospel Women, stories that focus on women who are named in the Gospel. So in just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those 4 books. The last book I've got here is a funny one and an interesting one and might be worth reading. Certainly would be the easiest read of the 4. Rachel Held Evans was an evangelical Christian woman, author, faith leader. She died, unfortunately, at a very early age. But she got tired of hearing people talk about biblical womanhood and said, well, what does it really mean to be a woman in the Bible? And so she spent a year trying to live by the teachings that the Bible presents for women. As you can guess, there's a lot of humor in there because some of them seem rather ludicrous. So she subtitled her book, How a Liberated Woman Found Herself Sitting on a Roof, Covering Her Head and Calling Her Husband Master. I encourage you. I've read it. It's a fun book, but it does raise some questions. Like I said, this is a topic that we could spend a whole semester on. So I encourage you to check out more if you like. I really look forward to reading your thoughts about the stories that we read together and seeing what you think of the interpretations I've presented here, as well as the interpretations that you might have either grown up with or come to on your own accord when first reading these stories. Let's continue the conversation, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.